Adolf Hitler's rise and fall. The bunker was silent except for the distant rumble of collapsing buildings. Dust drifted from the ceiling as the ground shook again. Outside, Berlin was falling piece by piece. Inside, a man once feared by millions sat hunched over a map that no longer meant anything. His hands trembled. His eyes were hollow. The empire he built with violence and hatred was turning to ashes around him. Adolf Hitler had reached the final days of his life, surrounded not by victory but by destruction of his own making. He could hear hurried footsteps in the hallway as officers whispered about the advancing armies. Their voices carried fear. They knew the end was near. The man who once spoke with fiery confidence now stared at nothing, unable to accept the truth he created. His plans had failed. The world had risen against him. The hatred he spread had consumed everything, including himself. In the dimly lit bunker room he looked older than his age. The war had taken its toll. His dreams of domination had collapsed into ruins. His promises of glory had led only to suffering and death. He held no power now. He held no control. He held only memories of the path that led him to this dark underground chamber. The rise had been loud and aggressive, but the fall was quiet, heavy, and final. As the walls shook again, he closed his eyes. He remembered another time before the speeches, before the crowds, before the destruction. A time when he was simply a boy in Austria searching for meaning. The world outside the bunker faded, and his memories pulled him backward to the beginning of a journey that would change history forever. He grew up in a small town where life was simple and strict. His father was harsh and expected obedience. His mother was gentle and filled with love. The young boy felt torn between fear and affection. He struggled in school, not because he lacked ability but because he refused to follow rules he didn't respect. Teachers described him as stubborn and restless. He often drifted into daydreams, imagining a world where he was free from authority. As he grew older, he discovered an interest in art. He imagined himself becoming a painter. He dreamed of creating beautiful landscapes and inspiring scenes. He wanted a peaceful life filled with creativity. But life does not always follow the dreams of youth. When he applied to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, he was rejected. The rejection hit him hard. It felt like the world had closed its door on him. He tried again the next year and was rejected once more. These failures shaped him in painful ways. Vienna was a difficult city for him. He lived in cheap rooms and struggled to survive. He felt invisible and powerless. As he wandered the streets, he began to absorb dangerous ideas circulating in the city. Hatred and anger found their way into his thoughts. He blamed others for his failures and looked for someone to blame for his suffering. The bitterness grew inside him quietly like a hidden fire waiting for air. Vienna became the place where his frustrations deepened. Instead of learning from rejection, he allowed it to transform into resentment. He listened to voices that fed his anger. He read books that strengthened his prejudices. He let hate replace hope. He did not realize that these thoughts would one day change the world in the worst possible way. Years later, when war broke out, he joined the German army. The military gave him a sense of purpose he had never felt before. He carried messages between trenches and admired the discipline and order around him. He believed he had finally found a place where he belonged. The war hardened him but also gave him a direction. When Germany lost the war, anger consumed him once again. He felt betrayed. He blamed others instead of accepting the reality of conflict and suffering. After the war, he entered politics in Munich. The early days were small and uncertain, but he had discovered something powerful within himself. He could speak in a way that stirred emotions. Crowds listened to him. People who felt desperate and hopeless after the war were drawn to his fiery speeches. His anger became their anger. His blame became their blame. His words grew louder and more dangerous. Slowly he rose. He gathered followers. He took advantage of fear and instability. Germany was suffering from economic crisis and political chaos, and he used these conditions to gain support. People wanted answers, and he offered them simple ones even though they were filled with hatred and lies. He promised strength. He promised unity. He promised a future where Germany would rise again. His promises were powerful enough to blind many to the darkness behind them. By the time he became the leader of the nation, he had built an image of confidence and authority. But behind the speeches and gestures there was a man shaped by resentment, rejection, and bitterness. His rise was not the result of wisdom but of anger turned into influence. His power grew rapidly, and so did the danger he carried within him. He controlled the government. He controlled the military. He controlled the media. Slowly he removed anyone who stood against him. He created fear and used it to rule. Many saw the warning signs but felt too afraid to resist. Others believed in his false promises and followed him against their better judgment. He stood before massive crowds who cheered loudly, but the noise hid the truth. He was leading them toward destruction. The decisions he made brought Europe into war. Country after country fell under attack. Innocent people suffered. Families were torn apart. Entire communities lived in fear. His hatred created some of the darkest chapters in human history. And as the war continued, his vision grew more distorted. He refused to accept reality. He surrounded himself with people who agreed with him even when his plans made no sense. Now in the bunker many years later, he faced the final result of his actions. The armies he once commanded were defeated. The cities he promised to protect were ruined. The people he claimed to lead were suffering because of him. His rise had been built on hatred and lies, and hatred always collapses under its own weight. The man in the bunker did not want to remember these things, but memories flooded his mind. They showed him the path he had walked. They showed him the choices he had made. They showed him the consequences he had caused. The rise had been full of noise and fire. The fall was silent, cold, and lonely. The bunker shook again as the walls trembled. His officers stood outside the room whispering nervously. They knew it was only a matter of time before everything ended. The man inside stared at the map one last time and realized he had nothing left. No power, no control, no future, only the truth of his own destruction. This was the final chapter of a life shaped by hatred and fueled by anger. A rise that brought millions of people into fear and suffering. A fall that showed the world the cost of following dangerous leaders. His story was not one of greatness. It was a warning for every generation to come. The war had stretched across continents, and the world watched as Germany plunged deeper into chaos. Hitler's decisions became increasingly reckless and disconnected from reality. His belief in his own invincibility blinded him to the truth that surrounded him. Cities burned. Soldiers fell. Supplies ran short. His closest advisors began to doubt him, but fear kept them silent. No one dared to challenge the man who ruled with absolute authority. Inside Germany, ordinary people suffered the weight of the war. Families hid in basements as bombs fell from the sky. Children cried in fear. Streets were empty except for the sound of sirens. The promises of glory had turned into a nightmare, and the citizens who once cheered now whispered in fear of being heard. But resistance was dangerous. Many who spoke against the regime disappeared without explanation. As the war intensified, Hitler isolated himself further. He refused to accept reports of defeat. He dismissed generals who brought him bad news. He planned attacks that had no chance of success. The world outside the bunker grew darker, but he continued to live inside the world he had created in his mind. He blamed others for failures and refused to take responsibility for the suffering he caused. Slowly the circle around him grew smaller. Trusted commanders left or were removed. Allies turned away. Countries he once controlled fought back with strength and determination. Nations united against him because they understood the danger he posed to humanity. The more isolated he became, the more he relied on harsh decisions that only accelerated his downfall. As enemy forces approached Berlin, the city transformed into a battlefield. Buildings that had stood for centuries crumbled under fire. Smoke filled the air. The sound of explosions echoed day and night. People ran through the streets searching for safety, but nowhere felt safe anymore. The world was witnessing the consequences of one man's hatred and ambition. Inside the bunker, he listened to the chaos above while pretending victory was still possible. His officers tried to remain loyal, but fear controlled their every move. They looked at him and saw not a leader but a man lost in the shadows of his own fantasies. He clung to maps and strategies that no longer had meaning. His empire existed only in his imagination. As days passed, the truth could no longer be denied. His armies were collapsing. His allies were gone. Berlin was encircled. The end was near. Yet he refused to surrender. He would rather watch the world burn than accept defeat. It was no longer about Germany. It was no longer about the people. It was only about his ego and his refusal to let go of power. Outside the bunker, the reality of his decisions was clear. Millions had lost their lives. Cities lay in ruins. Families were torn apart. The war he created brought unimaginable pain to humanity. And while the world suffered, he retreated deeper underground, refusing to see what he had done. The bunker darkened as electricity flickered. Food supplies dwindled. The mood inside grew colder and more hopeless. Officers whispered about escape, but none dared to act. They knew they were trapped with a man who had destroyed everything he touched. The air felt heavy with fear and regret. Above ground, the armies continued advancing. They moved street by street, gaining control of the city. Each hour brought them closer to the bunker. Every explosion was a reminder that time was running out. The world was closing in on Hitler, and there was no path left for him to escape. He sat alone in his room, thinking about the life he had lived. He remembered the early years of ambition when he believed he could lift Germany. He remembered the speeches, the cheers, the crowds that once adored him. But now those memories felt empty. Power had left him. Respect had vanished. Only guilt and destruction remained. He looked around the bunker one last time. The walls were cracked. The air was stale. His dreams were broken. The silence of the room felt louder than the bombs above. He realized that everything he built had collapsed. His rise had led only to ruin, and his fall would be remembered forever as a warning to the world. The sounds above grew louder. The ground trembled. The soldiers he once commanded were gone. The empire he created existed no more. He had lost everything except the memory of the hatred that guided his actions. It was in this darkness that he understood his story would never be one of triumph. It would be a story of destruction caused by fear, anger, and prejudice. The bunker became his final prison. The world he tried to control now stood against him. His rise had been built on division and violence, and now the consequences had come back to him. In the end he faced the truth that hatred always destroys the one who carries it. His fall was complete. His legacy was a lesson carved into history. 1532, November 17, 2025, Chaberneau. The city above the bunker continued to fall apart. Streets that once carried life were covered in rubble. Smoke rose into the sky and blocked the sun. People searched for shelter with fear in their eyes. Every corner of Berlin showed the cost of the choices Hitler had made. The war that he started had reached its final stage and the destruction surrounded him from every side. As the enemy armies moved closer, the bunker became a place of despair. Officers who once followed every order now struggled to hide their fear. They tried to stay calm, but the tension inside the underground hallways grew heavier with each passing hour. Hope had disappeared long ago, and now only the sound of approaching footsteps from enemy soldiers filled their minds. Everyone inside knew they were reaching the end. Hitler spent most of his time in a small dim room staring at the walls. His thoughts were scattered. His hands shook when he tried to write. He avoided mirrors because he did not want to see the face that had caused so much destruction. He blamed others for the failures, but deep inside he sensed the truth. His vision had been twisted by hatred and his plans had led Germany into disaster. He could no longer hide from the consequences. Outside the bunker, Berlin's defenses collapsed. Streets were taken one by one. The enemy flags replaced the symbols of the empire that once believed it would last 1,000 years. Reality moved quickly and every moment brought more losses. Buildings crumbled. Fires spread. The people who survived watched their world change in front of their eyes. Inside the bunker, confusion grew. Messages arrived from the front lines telling of defeat after defeat. Hitler refused to believe them at first, but as the hours passed, even he could no longer deny the truth. His generals avoided his eyes. They knew there was nothing left to fight for. They stood in silence, waiting for instructions that would never come. The bunker became darker as the power flickered. The air felt heavy and cold. People spoke in whispers. No one dared to speak about hope because hope no longer existed. They had followed a path that led only to ruin, and now they were trapped beneath the city that was falling apart. The world above them had already moved on. The war was almost over. Hitler walked slowly through the narrow hallways of the bunker. His steps echoed softly. The man who once shouted powerful speeches could barely speak. He stopped in front of a door and listened to the distant explosions. Those sounds carried the truth. Everything he had built was broken. Everything he believed in had failed. He stood still, trying to understand how the world he imagined had turned into such darkness. He returned to his room and sat down once more. Maps lay scattered on the table, but they meant nothing now. He stared at them without seeing anything. The empire he dreamed of existed only on paper. Outside those walls lay the reality of defeat. He felt the weight of everything he had done and everything he had caused. His mind could not find escape from the truth. The enemy troops were now inside the city center. The final barriers had fallen. The bunker was surrounded. Officers inside faced the moment they had feared. They knew they would not leave alive. Some looked for ways to escape, but there were none. Others accepted their fate quietly. They had followed a path that led to this moment, and now they could not turn back. Hitler felt a strange stillness inside him. He understood he would not live to face the world outside. He refused surrender and he refused capture. He chose to end his story the same way he lived it, through destruction. He gave his final orders with a tired voice. The people around him stepped back. They knew the end was moments away. He entered the small room where he spent his final hours. The sounds of war filled the air above. The walls shook again. The world he tried to dominate had risen against him and defeated him. The man who once held enormous power now stood alone, surrounded by darkness he created. His rise had been sharp and loud. His fall was quiet and absolute. A single moment ended his life. The bunker trembled. Officers outside stood in silence. They realized the man who ruled with fear was gone. The war would soon end. The nightmare that lasted years was finally breaking apart. Above ground, people slowly came out from hiding. Soldiers took control of the streets. The sound of gunfire faded. The world felt the weight of what had happened. The damage was beyond imagination. Millions of lives lost. Entire cities destroyed. Families torn apart. The war had left wounds that would take generations to heal. Hitler's end did not bring relief to everyone. It brought the cold truth of what hatred can lead to. Historians would later study his rise and fall to understand how one person could bring so much destruction. They would explain how fear, anger, and manipulation allowed him to gain power. They would show how unchecked hatred can spread and turn into violence on a massive scale. The world looked at his story and made a silent promise. They would not forget. They would not repeat the mistakes that allowed him to rise. They would teach future generations about the dangers of hatred and the importance of compassion and unity. Hitler's fall became a warning written into history. A reminder that darkness grows when people stop questioning and stop caring. His story remains one of the darkest chapters of human history. A rise built on lies. A rule built on fear. A fall that showed the true cost of hatred. His life became a lesson that the world continues to remember. A lesson that power without humanity destroys everything, including the one who holds it. News of Hitler's death spread through the bunker with a strange and heavy silence. Some officers stared at the floor, unable to speak. Others looked at one another with hollow expressions. They had followed him for years, and now he was gone, leaving behind nothing but destruction and regret. No victory. No honor. Just the end of a path that had taken Europe into chaos. Above ground, the war still continued for a short while, but the center of his leadership had collapsed. Soldiers of the enemy forces moved deeper into Berlin, facing less resistance as each day passed. The streets filled with signs of surrender. White cloths hung from shattered windows. People walked slowly through the debris, unsure if it was truly over or if more danger was hidden behind the silence. In the days that followed, the full truth of Hitler's regime began to surface. The world learned about the unimaginable crimes committed under his rule. Camps that had been hidden from sight were discovered. Survivors emerged with empty eyes and stories that shook humanity to its core. The truth revealed that the hatred he spread had led to suffering far beyond anything people had understood during the war. Entire communities had been destroyed. Families wiped out. Lives broken forever. People around the world looked at these horrors and realized the depth of the darkness that had controlled Germany. Hitler's fall was not just the fall of a dictator. It was the collapse of an ideology built on fear and cruelty. Nations united to ensure that such events would never be allowed to happen again. The world wanted justice. The world wanted truth. The world wanted peace. In Germany, ordinary citizens tried to rebuild their lives. They walked through ruins searching for loved ones and trying to understand how their country had reached such a terrible place. Many were filled with guilt. Others were filled with shame. Some were angry at themselves for believing lies. Some were angry at those who had remained silent. Everyone carried a part of the pain left behind by the war. Hitler's rise had been fueled by desperation, unstable politics, and economic crisis. He had promised strength, but he delivered destruction. His speeches had sounded powerful, but they had been built on hatred and division. People learned that it is easy for fear to grow when society is broken. They learned how quickly a nation can fall when it follows a dangerous leader without questioning his intentions. The world began to rebuild slowly. Countries worked together to restore peace and rebuild trust. Leaders met to create agreements that would protect future generations from similar disasters. Education became a powerful tool. Children learned about the war not to relive the past but to understand how to avoid repeating it. Hitler's story was taught not as a tale of power but as a warning of what happens when hatred is allowed to grow unchecked. Over time, Germany transformed. It faced its past honestly. It rebuilt its cities and worked towards becoming a strong and peaceful nation. Memorials were created to honor the victims of Hitler's regime. Museums were built to preserve the truth. People visited these places with heavy hearts, knowing that remembering the past was the only way to protect the future. Hitler himself became a symbol of ultimate failure. A reminder that cruelty and obsession with power lead not to greatness but to ruin. His rise had been built on promises of strength. His fall revealed the weakness behind those promises. His legacy became a lesson that power without compassion destroys everything in its path. Around the world, people spoke about him not with admiration but with caution. Experts studied his personality and the psychology behind his decisions. They examined how he manipulated emotions and used propaganda to control minds. They explained how hatred can spread like a disease when people stop standing up for what is right. His life became a subject of study for generations, not to celebrate him but to understand how dangerous ideologies take root. Writers and filmmakers began creating stories about the war to show the truth to new audiences. They told stories of courage, suffering, resistance, and survival. Hitler's role in these stories was always the same, the source of the darkness that others had to escape. These stories ensured that the memories would not fade. They kept reminding the world that the price of hatred is far too high. The world grew stronger because of the lessons learned from his rule. Countries formed long-lasting partnerships. Communities pushed for human rights and equality. Activists fought against discrimination. Nations recognized the importance of protecting freedom and dignity. All of this came from the pain left behind by the war that Hitler had started. His fall marked the beginning of a new age of awareness. People understood that leadership requires empathy. They understood that power should serve humanity, not destroy it. They understood that silence in the face of injustice allows darkness to grow. Hitler's life became a constant reminder that everyone has a responsibility to speak out against hatred. As decades passed, his name remained dark in history. He was remembered not for greatness but for the destruction he caused. His ambition had turned into violence. His beliefs had turned into suffering. His decisions had turned the world toward war. His story was told again and again, but always as a warning, not a celebration. In many cities around the world, monuments were built to honor the victims of the war. People gathered every year to remember those who lost their lives. They spoke about the importance of unity and compassion. They looked at their children and hoped that they would grow up in a world free from fear and hatred. These gatherings were filled with emotion because they carried the memories of the pain caused by his rule. Each generation learned that peace is fragile and must be protected. They learned that leaders must be questioned. They learned that hatred begins with small moments and grows when ignored. They learned that humanity's greatest strength lies in kindness, understanding, and the courage to stand together. Hitler's story ended in the darkness of a bunker beneath a collapsing city. His rise had been swift, but his fall was absolute. His choices brought suffering to millions, and his legacy became a reminder of the dangers of hatred and unchecked power. His life stands in history as a warning to the world that the path of division leads only to destruction. In the years after the war, the world slowly began to heal. Countries rebuilt their cities and their hopes. Families tried to put their lives back together after losing so much. Children who had grown up in fear now played on streets where silence had once ruled. It was a long and painful process, but the world moved forward with a deeper understanding of the cost of hatred. Germany faced the difficult task of confronting its past. It separated itself from the ideology that had destroyed so many lives. New leaders stepped forward determined to rebuild their nation with values opposite to those that Hitler had spread. They wanted a future built on trust, not fear, on cooperation, not violence. Schools taught the truth about the war so that no one would forget the mistakes that led to such devastation. Slowly, Germany transformed into a strong and peaceful country. It built bridges with nations that had once been its enemies. It became a voice for unity and human rights. The world watched this transformation with respect because it showed that even after deep darkness, a nation can rebuild with honesty and strength. The lessons of the past guided every step toward a better future. Historians continued to study Hitler's rise and fall. They examined the early signs of danger that many had ignored. They pointed out the moments when society could have stopped him but chose silence. They explained how propaganda twisted truth and how fear silenced opposition. Their work served as a reminder that democracy must always be protected. People learned that dictators rise when citizens stop questioning and stop caring. In homes across the world, grandparents told their grandchildren stories of the war. They described the fear, the loss, and the moments when kindness kept hope alive. They shared memories of neighbors helping each other even when everything seemed broken. They reminded the younger generation that humanity's greatest strength is compassion. These stories helped shape a culture that refused to accept hatred as a normal part of life. As decades passed, people continued to visit memorials built in honor of those who suffered under Hitler's rule. They walked through halls filled with photographs and personal belongings of victims. Each object told a story of a life cut short. Visitors moved quietly through these spaces, feeling the weight of history. Many left with tears, realizing the true impact of the pain caused by one man's rise to power. Through these memorials, the world ensured that the victims would never be forgotten. Their stories survived through generations. Their memories helped future societies recognize danger. Their voices became warnings that echoed through time. They reminded people that peace is precious and must be protected with courage. Hitler's story stood in contrast to these lives. His ambitions had grown from resentment. His influence had grown through manipulation. His rule had grown through fear. But in the end, all of it collapsed. His empire crumbled. His plans failed. His ideology was rejected by the world. He left behind nothing but destruction and sorrow. His life became a symbol of consequences, not achievement. Nations used his fall to strengthen their commitment to human rights. They created laws to protect people from discrimination. They encouraged unity among diverse communities. They built organizations that promoted peace and cooperation. All of these efforts were shaped by the memory of the war. The world understood that harmony cannot be taken for granted. It must be defended every day. Teachers continued to tell students about his rise and fall because it showed the importance of critical thinking. They explained that dangerous leaders often rise when people feel desperate. They emphasized how important it is to question promises that sound too perfect. Students learned that real leadership brings people together instead of dividing them. They learned that kindness is stronger than anger and that truth is stronger than lies. Over time, the world saw new challenges, but the lessons from Hitler's rule remained. Whenever hatred appeared in any part of society, people remembered the past and stood against it. Whenever fear tried to divide communities, people worked to build unity. The memory of the war encouraged humanity to choose peace again and again. Hitler's story became a permanent warning for the world. It showed how quickly a society can fall when hatred spreads unchecked. It showed how a single leader can cause immense suffering when given too much power. It showed how silence in the face of injustice can lead to unimaginable consequences. His rise was a tragedy and his fall was a lesson the world vowed never to forget. As the generations changed, the message stayed the same. Leaders must be questioned. Power must be balanced. Humanity must be protected. People must care for one another regardless of differences. Peace must never be taken lightly. This understanding shaped the modern world in ways that continue to protect future generations. Today, when people look back at Hitler's life, they do not see greatness. They see a warning written in history. A warning that hatred consumes everything it touches. A warning that violence and cruelty lead only to destruction. A warning that the world must stay united in the face of darkness. His story remains alive not as a celebration but as a reminder of what humanity must never allow to happen again. In the end, his rise and fall became a story that shaped the world's conscience. His path revealed the danger of extreme thinking. His collapse showed the strength of unity. His failures taught the world the value of compassion. His life closed in darkness, but from that darkness the world learned to seek light. That light continues to guide humanity toward peace, understanding, and a future where the lessons of the past are never forgotten. Thanks for watching. If this story added even a little spark to your mindset, don't forget to like the video. Hit subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss our next drop. From motivational book summaries, to famous personality stories, to life growth lessons that level up your English and your thinking. Keep learning, keep growing. This is English Amplify, signing off.